two stories remain as unbeatens collide for the title.
Could it get any more dramatic?
Jim Harbaugh and the Wolverines are looking to finish the mission, while Michael Penix Jr. and the Huskies hope to write their perfect ending.
The final chapter, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
A new playoff champion will be crowned. The College Football Playoff National Championship. Number 1 Michigan versus number 2 Washington. Monday at 7:30 Eastern on ESPN.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
Hello and welcome to The Paddock and the Pavilion with Stephen Wallace. In each show, Stephen will interview someone connected to the world of horse racing or cricket.
Hello everyone. 50 years ago, Secretariat won the Kentucky Derby and went on to win the American Triple Crown, the first horse to do so since 1948. In this podcast, you will hear from Jay Hovde, an award-winning American journalist and national columnist for Blood Horse Magazine and Blood Horse Daily, who has written 4 books on racing, including one of Cigar, the first winner of the Dubai World Cup. Jay also serves on the nominating committee for the Thoroughbred Racing Hall of Fame and is married to the Hall of Fame jockey Julie Crone. Joining Jay on the podcast is Chris Goodlett, the Senior Director of Curatorial and Educational Affairs at the Kentucky Derby Museum. Jay gives expert insight into the legendary horse's racing career, while Chris talks about the new exhibition, Secretariat, America's Horse. Hello, Jay. Welcome back to the Paddock and the Pavilion.
Stephen, it's great to be with you again. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And we're going to learn more about Secretariat today. Big Red. You last appeared in April 2021 on the podcast.
My goodness, has it been that long? What's keeping me from contacting you?
Well, that was episode 51. We're on about 191, I think, now. And we're also going to be hearing from Chris Goodlett from the Kentucky Derby Museum, who will appear during the podcast as well.
Wonderful. That's a great idea.
Well, let's go back to 1973 briefly. Can you believe it's 50 years ago since a Secretariat won the Kentucky Derby?
Well, Stephen, quite coincidentally, that was my first year in the racing business. I was hired out of college to work on the publicity staffs at Santa Anita Park, Del Mar, and Hollywood Park. And 1973 was my first full season on the Southern California circuit in that capacity. And Secretariat reigning across the land was, I just figured racing's like this all the time, isn't it?
Were you there at Churchill Downs in 1973?
I was not. I was manning the shop back in California during the Hollywood Park meeting, but we had a very heavily vested interest in what went on at Churchill Downs that year because of Sham. Sham, the pretense colt who came up through the stakes program at Santa Anita that winter, was a very commanding presence. He was thoroughly tested by another very good 3-year-old named Linda's Chief. They had quite a series of races together at Santa Anita, ending with Sham winning the Santa Anita Derby, equaling the stakes record at the time. And that stakes record had been set by Lucky Debonair, who won the Kentucky Derby of 1965, of course. So Sham was sent east after the Santa Anita Derby with a lot of high hopes for Californians because, as far as we were concerned, Secretariat was just some hotshot 2-year-old who was a fly-by-night and winning a lot of New York races against New York horses. And Californians weren't too easily impressed.
Well, let's go back to the beginning of the Secretariat story. It's an interesting one with the owner, the trainer, the jockey, and the groom. Were they all key to Secretariat's success?
Well, by the time Secretariat came along as a 2-year-old in 1972, they were pretty much wrapped up in the adventure that they were living with Reva Ridge, his year-older stablemate. I mean, he'd been a 2-year-old champion. He'd been the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes winner. He was the champion actually not champion 3-year-old because he was bested in the ballot box by Keita the Mint. But that was a bit of a controversy. So as 1972 ended, Reva Ridge was, considered the stable favorite. Secretariat was, a brilliant 2-year-old who received enough national acclaim to become the horse of the year that year as a 2-year-old, the first time that had ever happened since the balloting had been begun by the Daily Racing Form in the mid-1930s. So 1973 dawned with a pretty powerful 2-horse stable for Meadow Stud, trainer Lucien Laurin, and owner Penny Chenery.
For UK listeners, can you let us know a bit more about those 4 people I just mentioned? The owner, trainer, jockey, and groom.
Well, there was a very Canadian connection between the trainer and the jockey, of course, Lucien Laurin and Ron Turcotte, both native Canadians. They had a pretty good relationship together. They'd won stakes together. Lucien Laurin himself had won a previous Belmont Stakes in the 60s. And he was on his way to retirement, essentially, when the Meadow Stable job came open. And he was recommended and accepted the job as sort of, this is better than playing golf. And took over and immediately had his hands on 2-year-old Reva Ridge, and in the following year, 2-year-old Secretariat. Turcotte was very much a known quantity. He was well-respected, on his way to the Hall of Fame, almost with or without Secretariat, as one of the top stakes jockeys on the New York, Florida circuit. As for Penny Chenery, she was heir to the Meadow stable that had been nurtured by her father, Christopher Chenery, who was made his fortune in power companies along the East Coast during the middle of the 20th century. And as her father became a little more frail and ailing as he aged, Penny took a little more interest in the operation of the stable. And upon his death, she was in full charge. He did not get to see Secretariat in full bloom, but she always deferred to her father's mentoring and his spirit as she took Secretariat through his adventures.
Secretariat ran 9 times as a 2-year-old, but he lost his first race.
Yeah, he's a big kind of growthy, laid-back colt, and he got bounced around pretty good coming out of the gate that day. And the jockey Benny Feliciano was under instructions to just make sure that he doesn't have a terrible experience in his first race. These were the days when trainers used races to train their horses. That's not that he wasn't necessarily well meant, but it just wasn't his day. So let's not worry about him. Bring him back and wait for the next one, which they did, and he was off and running from there.
And then at the end of his 2-year-old season, or before he started his 3-year-old season, he was syndicated.
That was upon the death of Christopher Chenery. Estate taxes, which were and still are, I presume, difficult to avoid at that level, required quite a hunk of the family's liquid resources. And so it was arranged through Claiborne Farm and through the son of the Claiborne Farm establishment, breeder Bull Hancock, who had passed away also. This was a real second-generation kind of operation for Secretariat because Seth Hancock, Bull Hancock's son, was, not yet 30 at the time, and he took charge of the syndication and was able to put together shares to value the horse at $6 million, with the caveat that he would only race as a 3-year-old and be retired.
That would be quite unusual for a horse before they started their 3-year-old campaign, though.
That's true, but the precedent that Hancock was looking at was I believe, was the syndication of Nijinsky. And he wanted Secretariat to come in just a little bit higher, just so he would have the advertising ability to say this is the world's most valuable stallion. And so he did. And of course, at the time, Nijinsky was the reigning superstar that Europe had seen, and the Triple Crown champion of England in 1970. So it was, it was in the right spirit that Hancock was thinking.
Moving on to the beginning of his 3-year-old campaign, he lost his race before the Kentucky Derby at the Wood Memorial, only coming third.
He did, and never took the bit that day because he had a small abscess on his upper lip, I believe, that just pretty much prevented him from really being his very aggressive self through the last parts of his races, which he always had been. It was shocking, of course, and that news did not come out immediately. So as far as much of the cognoscenti were concerned, well, here was just another son of bold ruler who wasn't going to be able to get the Derby distance of 1.25 miles. To that point, Bold Ruler had been the dominant stallion in America, but his sons had never won a Kentucky Derby, and didn't look like they were going to, even with Secretariat's obvious superiority over most of the members of his class. The Wood was very oddly run. There was a slow pace setter. He kept going, and he was a decent quality horse who just happened to be a stablemate of Secretariat's. Sham came west from California to finish second. And of course, Lafitte Pincaille, his jockey, was watching Secretariat for most of the race and sort of let the horse on the lead a little bit more comfortably loose than he should have been. And there you have it, wire to wire for a long shot, and panic ensued.
2 weeks later, the Kentucky Derby. What was the build-up like to the race? You've mentioned him before. You had high regard for Sham.
My good friend and first employer in the racing business, named Dan Smith of Del Mar and Santa Anita at the time, always went back to Churchill Downs to work with the publicity staff back there. There was kind of an all hands on deck for handling the media in those days, and still is. So Dan was dispatched with, my precious $10 to bet on Sham and a plea for a daily update on how our horse was doing back there. Well, it was the morning, I believe Tuesday, before the Kentucky Derby, and Secretariat went out for a 5-furlong exercise and absolutely, blew the doors off the racetrack. And I get a call from Dan. Of course, we didn't know about the workout in California until it would hit the newspapers later that day or the next day. Dan just said, Jay, we're in trouble. And that's all I needed to hear from Dan, because he knew what he was seeing. He saw Secretariat in the absolute bloom of health. Anything lingering from the Wood Memorial was well past. And Sham was going to have to run the race of his life to be contentious. He did, and that wasn't good enough.
13 runners, but Secretariat was slow away.
Well, that was his style, and no one was surprised. In fact, he was slow away, but one of the many legendary pieces of that particular Kentucky Derby is that he ran each quarter faster than the previous quarter, including the last, and to get to the stakes and the track record. That's pretty remarkable for any American thoroughbred. That is not the way we run our races over here, even at the very top of the game. And that's what he did that day. And he just was in another orbit from the rest of the field. And it was a pretty good field. There were some very good horses behind him, including Forgo, who went on to be Horse of the Year in this country for 3 straight years once Secretariat had cleared the deck.
After the Kentucky Derby, did he become even more of a sporting icon?
Well, there were skeptics. He had won one race in a row. The sporting world the general sporting world loves the Kentucky Derby. And of course, he made all the right, headlines in doing what he did, setting a Kentucky Derby record and that sort of thing. But in the Preakness, he completely turned the stakes around, where he was now in a completely different realm than other horses, with his incredible move on the first turn to seize the race by the throat and simply, run the rest of the field ragged. His slow start was typical again in the Preakness, but going into the first turn, Turcotte just decided that we're not going to fool around with trying to weave our way through this field or around and down and up. And he took him on a circuit route to the backstretch around the field and was in front by the time they hit the back straightaway and improved his position from there.
Yes, he won the Preakness by 2.5 lengths. What was the hype like then for the Belmont Stakes with the sort of chance of winning the Triple Crown?
Well, that's when it really kicked into high gear. Of course, we've all seen his Triple Crown of news magazines. He made the cover of Time, Newsweek, and Sports Illustrated all at once. And that had never happened before with any particular sporting personality. Both Time and Newsweek, not being particularly original, but certainly belaboring the absolutely true obvious, used the headline "Super Horse," and Sports Illustrated had been on the story from the beginning with their reporters. So it was he was hyped to the absolute rafters. I noticed I took a look to review what's called the Nielsen ratings, which are a television rating system of how many households are actually watching a particular program. And at the height of television in this country, certainly when there were only the 3 networks and local stations and local affiliates, when there weren't as many choices, more people tuned into the same things over and over again. And so the Nielsen's had a real heft to them. Well, according to the Nielsen ratings for the Belmont Stakes, 52% of the households in the United States of America were watching Secretariat that day. And that's never happened outside of a Super Bowl before.
And were you still in California?
I was. I was not on the traveling circuit in those days. There was work to be done at Hollywood Park. It was quite an exciting scene there to watch it via television with everyone else, the other 52% of households, and it was a absolutely thrilling experience to watch a horse dominate a race as important as the Belmont that Secretariat did by those 31 lengths. Chick Anderson, of course, had the famous racing call. Secretariat moving like a tremendous machine when he said farewell to the nearest pursuer on the far turn and just started to lengthen his margin. I got to know Chick later on because he came to Santa Anita to be the race caller in California, and Chick said he hadn't prepared that at all. It was a complete off the cuff ad lib, and one of those that has survived the decades since then as a touchstone of a race call announcer's work.
It must be one of the most remarkable races in the history of horse racing.
Well, it is. It's because of the importance. We've seen horses win by fabulous margins in lesser races, but this was the Belmont Stakes. This was a horse winning the first Triple Crown in 25 years. So all of those things enhanced what was already a remarkable visual feat. If he had won the Wood Memorial by 25 lengths, it wouldn't have gone down in the same kind of history. But this was the Belmont Stakes, and he was the first Triple Crown winner, the 9th Triple Crown winner in the history of American racing, and the first one since Citation in 1948. And all those things added up to make his Belmont Stakes and that 31 lengths, one of those numbers that every little girl and boy who has any kind of interest in horse racing history is possibly the first number that they memorize.
And what challenges, Jay, does the Triple Crown in America pose to a 3-year-old?
Well, unlike, say, the Triple Crown that's been established over the centuries now in England, we have 3 races in a period of 6 weeks, 3 different distances, 3 different racetracks. So it's a very compressed test of a thoroughbred's stamina and durability, and also ability to maintain a certain form. There are good reasons that there was a tremendous lag between 1978 when Affirmed won the Triple Crown and 2015 when American Pharoah finally did. And we're talking about different ways of campaigning horses, different levels of competition, and there just were very, a lot of close calls, but no horse until American Pharoah was able to put all 3 together. And he was obviously a very superior horse, certainly not another Secretariat, but for our day and age was as close as any horse came to that point.
Secretariat raced a lot of times, 21 times, winning 16 times. How did he come to lose some races?
Well, it's horse racing, Stephen. Where have you been? They all lose. Nijinsky lost his last 2 races, for goodness sakes, and still he's worshipped. Cigar lost 2 of his last 3. Zenyatta lost her last race. These things happen for one reason or another. Yes, he was a super horse, and yes, on his day and even on his off days, he was as good as every horse around him. But there were reasons in the Whitney, when he was defeated by the older horse Onion, Alan Jerkins, the trainer of Onion, brilliant watcher of the competition that he is, noticed during the week leading up to that particular race at Saratoga that Secretariat was not training with quite the same verve that he had been in the spring during the Triple Crown. And Jerkins took advantage of that with a good, solid Group 2.5, 2 type horse that was very much in form and got the job done, only by a length, but that was all it took. As far as the losing the Woodward Stakes, that was an odd bit of stable management when the race came up sloppy, and Reva Ridge was also entered for that race, and he just did not like a sloppy, muddy racetrack at all. Secretary was also entered, and Mrs. Chenery felt obligated to have the colors fly in that very important race at Belmont Park. So let's run the big horse. Let's run Secretariat. Well, he was not prepared perfectly for that race, and he did finish second, beaten by another Alan Jerkins horse that day. So, there are reasons that even the best ones get beat. 9 times out of 10, it's a failure of the people behind them for one reason or another.
But did horses 50 years ago race a lot more than they would do today?
Well, certainly, yes, they did. I mean, that's obvious, but it's tough to compare. I mean, we're talking about a different economy. We're talking about different kinds of people investing their money in horses. Horses have become commodified and marketed differently and to a greater extent today. So expectations are higher for return in specific ways. And, perhaps trainers have become a little more conservative with wanting to show their wares. There are so many reasons it's different today than it was 50 years ago that would be a whole nother show.
In November 1973, he came out to a farewell appearance at Aqueduct, and over 30,000 people came to see him.
Well, that will tell you something about his immediate popularity, but his lasting legacy. I guarantee that if 5 years later, in the height of his stallion career, that you said that he was going to lead the post parade for a race at Keeneland or a quiet Thursday at Churchill Downs, you'd get thousands and upon thousands of people that would throng just to see him in the flesh. I was lucky enough to see him at Claiborne Farm when I toured Kentucky a few years after he went to stud, and at Claiborne Farm he was one among many, I have to admit. Although just being able to see Secretariat was pretty exciting. But alongside of him was Round Table and Hoist the Flag in Damascus, so it was like going to the Louvre.
A new exhibition has just opened at the Kentucky Derby Museum, Secretariat, America's Horse, and last week I spoke to Chris Goodlett. When did you start planning for the exhibition, Secretariat, America's Horse?
Well, as we often say here, people will laugh at us, but, we only get one chance to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Secretariat. And I understand why people would laugh at that, but it's very true. You only get one opportunity to do that. So we've known for some time that we wanted to do something special for the 50th anniversary of Secretariat's Triple Crown. I would say active discussions about what we would do probably go back to 2020 during the pandemic year. We really started engaging with some partners and really thinking about what this exhibit might be, probably in the middle to latter part of 2021. So if you want to look at it from that frame of reference, you're looking at about 2 years or so, I would say at least, that we've really been actively planning for it, even though some discussions began a little bit earlier.
And what's on offer to visitors and racegoers on Kentucky Derby Day?
As far as this exhibition?
Yeah. Well, the Secretariat of America's Horse, I think there's several things that I think will be attractive to visitors and appealing to visitors about this exhibit. We do have some nice artifacts that we will have in the exhibition. We have some artifacts from the Chenery family, directly from the Chenery family. Penny Chenery, of course, the owner of Secretariat. So we have trophies documenting Secretariat's career. We have some of his Eclipse Awards, which originated in the early 70s. Those are what we often call here in America, we compare them to racing's Oscars because they're year-end awards that are given to horses, Horse of the Year, 2-year-old of the Year, 3-year-old of the Year, etc. And Secretariat won several of those in his 2- and 3-year-old season, and we have a couple on exhibit. So we do have several artifacts. We have some artifacts that talk about Meadow Stable before Secretariat. Of course, Meadow Stable, Secretariat's birthplace, has a long history with Christopher Chenery, who founded that farm in 1936, had a lot of champions prior to Secretariat. Of course, by the time Secretariat came along, Penny Chenery, his daughter, was in charge. But Meadow Stable has a long history. So we have some artifacts that kind of illustrate to people that as great as Secretariat was, as impactful as he was, there was a history to Meadow Stable before Secretariat came along. But outside of the artifacts, a couple of things that I think are really appealing in different ways of storytelling for the museum. We partnered with Solid Light, an exhibition firm here in Louisville, Kentucky, a noted design build firm here. And they are leaders in media projections. So in 4 different places in the museum, we have large, basically floor-to-ceiling media projections. Sometimes it's looping images. Sometimes it includes video. On one of those media projections in particular, on one of the 4, I would say in the centerpiece of the exhibition, we feature all 3 of his Triple Crown races from gate to wire. That's that 1973 Kentucky Derby here at Churchill Downs, the 73 Preakness Stakes in Baltimore, Maryland, and that 73 Belmont Stakes in Long Island, New York. So we feature all those races. Of course, he set records in all 3 of those races that still stand. And I think to see those races on that huge projection, seeing them from gate to wire, I think is pretty impactful. And it's very right that it be the centerpiece of the exhibition because there's so much to say about Secretariat, but I think you really can encapsulate so much about him just by seeing those 3 races alone. I think that really gives people an understanding of how dominant and how great of a racehorse he was. And you'll feel like you're in the cinema, I guess.
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit. With the way homes are these days and large size of televisions and television screens. It may not seem that way, but yeah, we think it's a very nice effect. And it's different from any other exhibition we have in the museum. I mean, our feature exhibition plays in a theater called the Great Hall on a 360-degree screen. But for the most part, our exhibitions on our first and second floor, these media projections are an element that we do not have in any of the exhibitions. And we wanted something unique for Secretariat. The artifacts, of course, are very important. You know, the lifeblood of a museum, and really seeing some of these artifacts for a horse like Secretariat had such a storied career and a storied life. But we think these media projections really set that exhibit apart and will be a great storytelling immersion and method for our visitors.
Now, we're recording here on the 13th of April. What are the timescales for when the Secretariat exhibition opens, and how long is it on for?
Well, the Secretariat exhibition will open to the public in a little over a week now, April 21st, a couple of weeks before this year's Kentucky Derby. This is a permanent exhibition at the museum. We're currently in a 5-year exhibit plan where we're upgrading all our permanent exhibitions, as it's been 10 plus years for many of them. So this will open April 21st. It'll be a permanent exhibition. Permanent exhibition in the museum world usually means it's here for at least 7 to 10 years. Of course, artifacts will change. Content of those media projections will change. But Secretariat, being a legendary horse, so important to racing, so important to the Derby, we feel he merits that permanent exhibition. So we're very excited about that here at the Derby Museum.
You must be very proud then to have this exhibition about Secretariat.
The Derby Museum is very proud to have this exhibition on Secretariat, not only because of his athletic achievements and his greatness as an athlete, not only because he's so important historically and continues to endure in our culture with his legacy and celebrity, but we had some great partners in the exhibition. We worked with an exhibit design firm, Solid Light, that has helped us create an experience that we think will be impactful to visitors. We've got to work with the Tweedy family, the sons and daughters of Penny Chenery, in getting some artifacts here and learning some of their stories about Secretariat that could be included in the exhibition. And there's been other partners as well. So we're very excited about the exhibition. It's really going to add a lot to the museum. It's helped us to create some partnerships that we know will endure. So we're excited to unveil it to the public in April and excited for people to see it.
And Chris, you've got the 150th Run for the Roses next year. More planning.
We do. Next year is the 150th run of the Kentucky Derby. One thing we always talk about to all our visitors, whether they're regular adult visitors or education groups, is we remind people that as we're coming up on that 150th anniversary, the first Kentucky Derby was in 1875. So when you do that math, that means we've never missed a year. All the things that have happened in the United States, world wars, Great Depression, a pandemic that happened just in 2020. We've never missed a Kentucky Derby. And that's an achievement we're proud of. So we're excited to celebrate that 150th next year.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
What did he and still does mean to Americans?
Well, it's difficult to say what a thoroughbred racehorse today, even in the past, means to modern culture. Racing is very marginalized in the United States. It has a smaller percentage of the sport's fan population as real, true, serious followers. But that smaller cohort is very, very dedicated. And I would think that if you had to measure the name recognition of thoroughbreds in a general population, and of course this would skew older, but you've got Man of War would be instantly recognized because his name has been invoked in so many different ways through history. Seabiscuit, certainly, primarily because of sort of the re-energizing of his story through Laura Hillenbrand's book and the subsequent very good movie that was nominated for an Oscar for Best Picture. Secretariat would come next on that list. Cigar had his moment in the sun. He campaigned far and wide for 2 years. He made all the magazines, all the news shows in the mid '90s, and was the horse that everyone knew. But that's faded away because he didn't win a Triple Crown race and wasn't a 3-year-old of note. So that's always kind of key to longevity. Zenyatta, I mean, how can you think otherwise that she's possibly the most famous mare to ever race in this country, with her unbeaten streak and her style of coming from nowhere. She was the subject of a great 60 Minutes feature segment that was seen by millions. So she certainly is fairly familiar to so many Americans these days in sports. And American Pharoah, of course, because of his Triple Crown landmark, the first one since 1978. That's just a handful of horses over all the years, but of those, Secretariat would still stand out simply because of the generational sort of inheritance that his name still resounds through the years.
What does Secretariat mean to Americans and people from Kentucky?
Well, Secretariat, I think, means a lot to horse racing in America. It means a lot to Kentucky as well. You know, for the Kentucky Derby, we've had 148 of them. The 149th is coming up this year. 114 of those Kentucky Derby winners were bred here in the state of Kentucky. So Kentucky is proud to call itself the thoroughbred capital of the world. And that's not just for racing, but the breeding. We are an epicenter of breeding here in the United States of America. So of those 114 that I mentioned, Secretariat's a little different because he was not Kentucky born. He was born in Virginia. The Channery Farm Meadow Stable was in Virginia. So he's a Virginia bred, born in Virginia. So sometimes people will joke with Kentuckians, why is he so important to Kentucky? He's a Virginia horse. And although that may be true, one of his greatest races was here in Kentucky, the Kentucky Derby. You know, he was most predominant in New York and the East Coast of the United States in his 2- and 3-year-old season when he was an active racehorse. The Derby was the only time he raced in Kentucky, but he set a track record of 159 2/5 that still stands. So that's one reason he's very important to Kentucky. But he continues to be important to Kentucky because even after his racing career, when he retired, when he went to a stallion career, that was at Claiborne Farm in Paris, Kentucky, about 70 miles or so east of Louisville, Kentucky, where the Kentucky Derby is run. So his stallion career was here. So he finished out his life here in the state of Kentucky till he died in 1989 due to complications from laminitis. So he's really important to Kentucky for the racing and for the breeding angle as well. But he is a huge, huge horse just in the United States of America. And I think, obviously, his racing achievements are part of that. You know, he came around in 72 and 73. And at that time, the United States of America was going through some turmoil. You know, you have the Watergate scandal of then President Richard Nixon that's going on. You have the Vietnam War. There are some sports writers that said that in the early 70s, Secretariat was kind of a respite from that. With his athletic achievements as a 2-year-old, he won the Eclipse Award for Horse of the Year as a 2-year-old. Only one other 2-year-old in the Eclipse Award era has done that. So it's a rare achievement for a 2-year-old to win Horse of the Year. But those achievements went on in his 3-year-old season. America was really attentive to what he was doing in the spring and early summer of 1973. You know, he won the Kentucky Derby he set a record here, set records in the Preakness Stakes, the second jewel of the Triple Crown, and the Belmont Stakes, the third jewel of the Triple Crown. And in his process of doing that, he was so popular at the time that he appeared on the covers of 3 magazines in the same week leading up to that Belmont Stakes. He appeared on the covers of Time Magazine, Newsweek, and Sports Illustrated. So he was popular from a news point of view as a newsmaker, but also as a sports icon and athlete. And all those covers came out the same week leading up to his dominant victory in the Belmont Stakes in 1973. So while he was actively racing, America was very engaged with what Secretariat was doing and achieving on the racetrack. But his importance to America has become even more apparent since then. He is one of the only horses, maybe the only horse, that really transcends the sport of racing in the United States of America. He has a celebrity that I feel is unmatched among horses here in the United States. After all those achievements he had with his racing career, he's had a postage stamp that was unveiled in 1999 that has Secretariat's image on it, the United States Postal Stamp. ESPN, the noted sports network, when it ranked its top 100 athletes of the 20th century, Secretariat was number 35. I believe he was the only horse on that list of the top 100 athletes of the 20th century. And of course, he went on in 2010 to have a film made about him. Walt Disney Pictures released a film named Secretariat. It said that Penny Chenry, the owner of Secretariat, got several offers for films before she finally approved Disney's script and their approach to the film and gave them the rights to make the film. So he's gone on to be so popular in American culture, even after that, even after his victories in 1973. And also, I'll just add, as far as an athlete, an equine athlete, there's usually one of two horses that are mentioned as the greatest horse in American horse racing history. Secretariat is one, Man of War is the other. Some people that are really knowledgeable about racing might name some others, but I think for the general public, those are the two names that really come out as the greatest racehorse of all time in the United States of America, Secretariat and Man of War. And I can say, just with the Kentucky Derby Museum, again, to illustrate his importance to Americans, we're a major tourist attraction here in Kentucky. A lot of our visitors from out of town, international visitors, they may only know a little bit about the Kentucky Derby. Maybe they saw it on television and they wondered, why does this race that lasts 2 minutes have 160, 170,000 people come every year? And they'll walk through the door to learn why that is. And we help them learn why that is. But if they know nothing else, maybe they just saw it on television, saw the masses and the crowds of people, they usually know that name, Secretariat. Even if they're not exactly clear on what he did and his importance, it's a name they've heard. And with this exhibition, we'll now get to engage them in, that's that name you may have known, that you may have heard, but let us tell you about why you've heard that name. Going through this exhibition, you're going to learn why he was so important and get an idea of why he was so significant to Americans. So I think for all those reasons, his athletic achievements, the things he's done, his celebrity, his legacy, which is really unmatched among horses, to me, that illustrates why he's so important to Kentucky and why he's so important to the United States of America.
He also won 2 races on the turf. Can you compare, because he did that, dirt with turf?
Right. Well, that was possibly the most exciting the most exciting thing he'd ever did. I think. I mean, certainly the Triple Crown was wonderful, but that's been done before, and not the way he did it, setting track records in all 3 races. But when he won the Belmont Stakes by 31 lengths, let's face it, he was beating 3-year-olds who had already been proven to be distanced in class with him, and Sham was basically pulled up that day, injured, and never ran again. Sham, at his very best that day, probably wouldn't have been within a dozen lengths of Secretariat at the end. So, all fairness to the big horse for running the race of his life. However, if you want to see a horse dominate good horses in a 1.5-mile race, you've got to look at a replay of the Canadian International Championship, his final race at Woodbine. And that is the one race that reminds me most of what Flightline did in his races during his Horse of the Year campaign last year. Secretariat simply absolutely ran away with utter contempt from very, very good turf horses like Kennedy Road, who was Canadian Horse of the Year, and Big Spruce, who was a winner of both the Marlborough Cup on dirt and San Luis Rey on turf, and just a host of really, really top grade 1 horses. Secretariat made them all look like hobby horses in that race. So that's the race that as far as I was concerned, put him in a class that probably will never be approached.
I was also thinking, because Secretariat ran on the turf, can you give any comparison to the top European turf horses?
Well, you'd like to think that he would have been competitive, and that as fast as he ran American style. He took his races by the throat early on the grass. He was able to encounter two fairly firm courses in the Man o' War Stakes and in the Canadian International. So who knows how he would have run on deeper courses. But his stride, Stephen, was so fluid, so mechanically perfect that I would think that almost any surface would have suited him. I get a kick out of what other great horsemen said when they encountered Secretariat for the first time. I ran across a quote from Tommy Smith, of all people, who was the great Australian champion trainer, trained Kingston Town and Tulloch, for goodness sakes, which is like saying you trained, Man o' War and Citation. But and not bad as a sire, since his daughter Gay Waterhouse became a champion trainer many times over as well. But when Tommy Smith encountered Secretariat, he simply said, he's an absolute perfect horse. And for someone who has that kind of a standard, to look at another man's horse and say, this one is perfect, that's enough for me to sort of park any opinions I might have by the side of the road and defer to those kind of people.
Returning to the present, what are your thoughts on the 149th Kentucky Derby?
Oh, it should be a scramble. I think there's a lot of horses that fit, within a very narrow range of ability. Of course, unproven as they all are this time of year, going 1.25 miles if it's a sternly run race. I have been a fan of the Santa Anita Derby winner, Practical Move, since his 2-year-old season. He's a son of Practical Joke, who is a stallion who's known for putting some speed in his horses, but he's also a son of a daughter of Fleet Alex, who won both the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes pretty comprehensively. So I'm not too worried about him getting 1.25 miles at this level. Forte, he's been pretty much flawless since he hit his best stride last fall in the Keeneland race and in the Breeders' Cup. So there's two horses right there that are going to make it interesting. But you can go 6 or 7 deep and make a case for several horses here, including one that might not even get in the race, named Skinner, son of Curlin, who is just on the outside of the 20 eligibles looking in and needs one more horse to scratch for him to get in. He was laying right on top of Practical Joke at the end of the Santa Anita Derby in a very close 3-way finish, and has been improving by leaps and bounds this winter for John Shirreffs, who all he did was win the Kentucky Derby with a similarly campaigned horse named Giacomo at 50-1.
Talking about 50-1, can it be as dramatic as last year's race?
Well, that was 80-1. Yes, right, exactly. And no, absolutely not. We won't see a Rich Strike sneak in, over the transom for a long time in the same way. That was unusual. That was every bit as shocking and bracing as when Mind That Bird came from New Mexico to win by 8.5 lengths at 50-1 back in 2009. So we've had some shockers in this century, and it's good. These slap us into reality that the Kentucky Derby is that one-off race that horses will never have encountered before, and will never encounter a race like that again. And quite literally, anything can and has happened.
That was certainly a difficult race to call last year's.
Well, yes. You can always reconstruct enough of a case for almost any horse when they upset a race like that. But we could be looking at a less than, let's just say, a more mediocre Derby group last year than this year. Unfortunately, several of the horses from that class weren't able to train on or make it into their 4-year-old season because of either injury or retirement. So we have no real feel for how good of a field Rich Strike was able to surprise. And, he hasn't won a race since then.
We must end with the star of the show, Secretariat. Looking back, you must feel grateful to have begun your own racing career in 1973.
There's no question that that sort of, branded me as a lifer. If horse racing is going to bring this much excitement, this much satisfaction, I was already a bit of an amateur historian, and for history to be unfolding, in real time, right in front of me, with having access to a lot of the players and a lot of the principals over the ensuing years, yes, I feel very fortunate that Secretariat, the entire story, has been part of my lifetime. And people that have come to the game after Secretariat's heyday and even after his death, I think that one of the first pages of history that they turn to is Secretariat, and rightfully so, because he is without question the most important horse of the 20th century for American thoroughbred racing.
Well, there couldn't be a finer way to end the podcast than that, Jay. Thank you again for being on the Paddock and the Pavilion.
Stephen, it's always a pleasure, even if it's only 2 or 3 years, to speak with you. And I hope you have a wonderful spring in racing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Paddock and the Pavilion.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at The Pad and Pav. Don't forget, if you like the show, please do leave us a rating and review.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.